So where to start? This quote really resonated with me when I read the article. I read it as part of a research project I'm currently working on with Professor James Hyam from the Department of Tourism and Dr. Debbie Hopkins from the Centre for Sustainability at Otago. And it's about academic mobilities, and I will talk to you a little bit about it later. I put that picture of me up there because it's very much about mobility with the plane behind, but I thought maybe that one was a bit of a better one. That's in Sweden, just outside of Falun, and they have those little, they sell those little horses, and so we were visiting, and that was the picture they used in their newsletter. So a different type of mobility, but quite fun. So I think it's very much that we need to really look at ourselves, but also look more broadly at the practices that very mobile individuals undertake. We've talked a lot in the last few days about middle-class, well-educated people from many countries and their increasingly transnational interactions. This extends beyond those groups, as we've been talking about this morning when we've been talking about students and those who are being challenged by climate change in their communities. So I think there's a lot going on, and I think it's really important that we really begin to look at those communities, at ourselves, and what we as social scientists can do to influence policy, to influence communities, and make a difference in people's lives. My second context is this one. Academic travel causes global warming. I know it's from 2008, but it resonates with me because of the research I've been doing. It's my favourite headline at the moment. And if we keep reading, we can find some seriousness behind it. There's some quotes in there about how much carbon dioxide is put into the atmosphere by people, and I've got a couple of more. So Suzanne Becken from Griffith University in 2002 found that delegates' air travel related to energy consumption for the 2002 Ecotourism Conference could sustain 2,095 Nepalese citizens, 432 world citizens, or 90 Canadians for a whole year. Joseph Nevin's work in 2003 looking at carbon emissions from the Association of American Geographers Conference in Seattle found that per average attendee, air travel alone was 3.8 times the annual emissions of the average Denzian of Haiti and 2.7 times an average Bangladeshi. So I think these two really begin to situate where I'm coming from. A lot of the work that I'm looking at with the academic mobility is situated in this climate change sustainability area. Although I'm much more interested in the mobility side, I think that the resonance of what we're all facing in the future with transport, peak oil, all of those things comes into play. So let's back up and think, what is mobilities? It's a theory or concept often seen as an approach that's been taken over the last 10 to 15 years. We saw the emergence of the new mobilities paradigm with a couple of articles in 2006, although it's been talked about for a few years before that. We can see that it's got a much longer history, especially within areas such as transport studies, as well as other areas. But it's really been in the last 10 to 15 years that we've talked about it as a concept and as an approach. There are many definitions of mobilities that could be adopted. From the Centre of Mobilities Research Introduction, which says that this concept of mobilities encompasses both the large-scale movement of people, objects, capital and information across the world, as well as the more local processes of daily transportation, movement through public space, and the travel of material things with everyday life. To Hansen's discussion of mobility through time and space, and two main factors, that of physical mobility, the movement of people, knowledge, goods, and social mobility, i.e. the changes in social status. Scheller and Uri in 2006 suggest that the new mobilities paradigm needs to draw on theoretical resources that converge around studies of space, place, boundaries and movement, and go beyond the set interest and nomadic conceptualization of place and movement. They suggest that social science has largely ignored or trivialized the importance of systematic movement of people for work and family life, for leisure and pleasure, and for politics and protest. So for me, it's about relations rather than entities. It's a way of addressing people, objects, things, and places, and as Peter Adey says, it is a way of communicating meaning and significance. And it's also the predominant means by which one can engage with the modern world. So mobility is both familiar, whether we ourselves move or not, and to somewhat taken for granted. Creswell contends that all forms of mobility, they have a physical reality, they are encoded socially and culturally, and they are experienced through practice. As such, mobility is contingent on the capacity to access the right conditions, technologies, and networks that can enable movement across borders and cultures. It encompasses not only the corporeal travel of people and the physical movements of objects, but also imaginative travel, virtual travel, and communicative travel, enabling and coercing people to live more mobile lives. While today I'm tending to concentrate on the corporeal, our movement will also touch on and suggest relationships between and within corporeal mobilities and other mobilities, including knowledge, information and finance, as well as briefly thinking about the effective, haptic, sensory, non or more than representational. So why mobilities? I'm going back to the sort of the climate change sustainability debate with this quote from Gus Speth, an environmental lawyer, and where he says that the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed and apathy, and to deal with these we need a cultural and spiritual transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And I really like this in that it's not just about saying, hey look, the science is out there, it's actually about all those human things that go with it that mean it's actually difficult to put this into action. We've got the science, we know what we can do, and yet it's still not being done. So I think that's one reason why it's important. One of the major challenges, I think, is this. And so while I'm not going to be talking about the spiritual transformation, I think as social scientists, we can play an important part of that cultural shift. To put it very simply, climate change rhetoric has long been plagued with how to communicate in a way that everyone understands on one hand, and a belief or a need to ensure that it remains objective, or rather provides the full picture by giving all the information to the public so that they can make an informed decision about climate change. This has led to, and again I'm using basic examples to make my point, for instance food miles and the understanding that food miles are bad. And yet if you look at New Zealand lamb or butter or apples in supermarkets in the UK, they often have a smaller carbon footprint, including the transport that gets them there by sea, than the same products produced in the UK. In terms of providing a balanced view of climate change, this has allowed the skeptics to find information that backs up their claims that there is no such thing as climate change science. So it's part of the problem is how the information that's out there is being utilised. Mobilities is inherently interdisciplinary. It overlaps with aspects of globalization studies, communication research, migration, border studies, tourism studies, energy, climate change, public and preventative health, and much more. So as Mimi Scheller says in her recent article in Current Sociology, by bringing together studies of migration, transport, infrastructure, transnationalism, mobile communications, imaginative travel and tourism, new approaches to mobility are especially able to highlight the relation between local and global power geometries, bringing into view the political projects inherent in the power relations informing and processes of globalization, and thus calling into question associated claims of globality, fluidity, or opening. But why else do I think mobilities is important? As I've already said, I think it's about relations rather than entities. And in life, I'm a bit of a pragmatist with a small p. I'm not talking ontological or methodological pragmatism per se. So I'm going to go back to Scheller's paper again when she says that mobilities, it is neither structuralist nor post-structuralist, but instead advocates for a realist ontology for contemporary social science capable of transcending old debates and bridging disciplinary boundaries. And to me, that's hugely important about what we can see for mobilities. As a social and cultural geographer, now working in a tourism department in a business school, this comment really spoke to me. I see my work in mobilities as being relevant in many ways, but I also see that many people in many departments and many places switch off as soon as I say I work in a tourism department. It's an easy subject. It's all about business, and we just get to travel to lovely places. But in terms of funding opportunities, tourism is often seen as a dirty word. Very difficult sometimes to get funding using the word tourism. Use travel, use well-being, much easier. Yet tourism is the second largest industry in New Zealand. It employs almost 1 in 10 people, indirectly and directly, contributes 7.3 billion or 3.7% directly to New Zealand's GDP, and another 9.8 billion or 5% indirectly. It's the second largest industry. It's huge. So yet again, to use Scheller, and I promise I won't use her too much, she says, in every case, the expansive and innovative outlook of the mobilities paradigm lends new insights to existing research fields, bringing to light alternative perspectives and unnoticed relationships. Above all, it instigates a renewed mission for social science grounded in transdisciplinarity, public relevance, and critical innovation. Okay, let's go on to mobilities and resilience. I'm only going to really talk about this briefly, as I hope the points I try to make will sort of come through in some of the examples I give you, and I'm sure that many of you know much more about resilience than I do. So what is resilience? The quote here talks about resilience referring to the ability of individuals, places and populations to withstand stress and challenge. The quote, which comes from a report done out of Glasgow, goes on to say, for future public health, resilience thinking needs to go beyond preparing for isolated events to question the role that institutions, leaders and organisations play in creating vulnerabilities and in shaping society's ability to react to challenges, many of which are unpredictable. To this end, the authors of this report arrive at a definition of resilience for public health as the capacity for populations to endure, adapt, and generate new ways of thinking and functioning in the context of change, uncertainty, or adversity. The picture on this comes from an HR website, and I just want to read you the blurb that it says about that because I thought this was quite telling as well. Resilience is becoming a common word in the HR community and an increasingly importable and desirable quality for employees. It's fundamentally in motivating people and organisations to perform and even flourish in good and bad times. With budget and or staff cuts on the horizon, or as a reality for many workers, it is essential now more than ever that both employees and employees can draw on personal resilience. So it was all about the fact that it wasn't company resilience or government resilience or community resilience, it was personal resilience to cope with what a company would throw at you. Whether that was more work, less pay, longer hours, and I think that for many of us that really resonates. So what I really know of resilience, the term has migrated over from the natural and physical sciences. And I think often this means that it tends to have different meanings in different areas and subjects and disciplines to which it applies. So for instance, from what I can understand from the public health arena, it can be applied in an individual or community understanding. However, resilience has also become, according to McKinnon and Driscoll-Derrickson, a pervasive idiom for global governance, as it is abstract and malleable enough to encompass the worlds of high finance, defence and urban infrastructure. They suggest that this understanding of resilience brought over from ecology and systems theory is actually quite conservative, and so it not only continues to privilege established social structures, i.e. unequal power relations, but that it also closed to questions of progressive social change. Thus, they see resilience as a way of activism, resilient spaces that can be periodically reinvented to meet changing demands. I think there's two other points that I want to make in our understanding of resilience. One, that resilience is often seen as a top-down approach utilised by government agencies, which puts the onus of being resilient and adaptable on individuals, on communities and on places, and so can reinforce social and spatial inequalities. And secondly, that the scale of this is often misconceived. It relies on an understanding or an underlying local-global division, which equates to different arenas or scales, ensuring adaptability in the face of threats. And this means that the concept of the sources of resilience lies within particular scales rather than across or between scales. So conceived as being local rather than regional or national or intra all of these areas. And I think that's really important when we think about how we talk about resilience and how we research it and how that influences perhaps how we take it to policy. So what does all this mean? I want to consider this in relation to the future of mobilities and in relation to some of my research. So, young budget travellers, those on a gap year, those on their OE, those backpacking, Christians, young Wanderungsgellen, am I right?
Wandergesellen.
Yeah. My German's not very good, I'm afraid, sorry. But let me also frame this in relation to past symposia first. At the 2010 symposium, Gabrielle Desolé from ANU talked of international mobility and third culture kids. Talking about children of serial migrants, she talked of this group as building relationships with many people and places, but that they often lacked full ownership or a sense of belonging to any culture. She talked about how these TCKs were using identity strategically, and a paper that she's presenting later this year at the European Association of Social Anthropologists, she goes further to suggest that for her participants, being international further implies the ability to make conscious and strategic use of national and international cultural elements interchangeably. She's referring to the contextual capacity to choose to adopt or reject certain local norms and rules without prejudice. And specifically within the highly valued field of cosmopolitan in TCK, she's talking about how they choose their identity. And to me, in many ways, this is resilience. We get to choose our identity in order to belong or to get ahead. So they're using identity and their multiple identities and also their lack of belonging as a way to understand themselves and be resilient to the way they've grown up and the uncertainties in where and how they belong. Now, some of my research has looked at work and young budget travellers. They often have working holiday visas. New Zealand has working holiday schemes with 41 different countries, and I think Australia has working holiday schemes with 27 different countries. They often volunteer with NGOs, work with the environment or local communities. They tend to interact longer with local communities than other types of tourists. They tend to spend more. And so they're a slightly different group. And one of the things that I have always been interested in with young budget travellers is that their mobility connects them with other young people from around the globe, and these connections last. They last for a lifetime. They don't just last for that visit. And with connectivity and digital connectivity the way it is, they last even longer. You Facebook everyone. You're on all of the different social media with all of the people that you meet. And I think these transnational relationships haven't been looked at enough because they impact on business, on culture, on migration in the short, medium and long term. A number of us here, I'm sure, will have more than one passport or residency. A number of us probably have partners, friends who are from somewhere else, and yet we probably all live in a third country. All of these ideas impact on the national, or what governments think of as the national, and we need to look at that in more detail and not just talk about it in terms such as migration. It needs to be looked at through a mobilities lens. They can also be students, and Hong Wang's paper this morning was really interesting for me because it looks at a lot of things that I've been thinking about. So New Zealand, for instance, sees students as something to be explored, and perhaps we could even say exploited for economic reasons. Certainly the Tourism Industry Association, in their new document, the Tourism 25, sees them as having great economic benefit or potential, and they want to increase the earnings from this group, or rather they want to increase the earnings from this group and their friends and relatives from 676 million at the moment to 1.3 billion by 2025. At the moment there's about 92,000 students, international students in New Zealand, or that's what they're saying. They want that to increase hugely. They see that family and friends spend more, stay longer and visit more domestic locations when they're here. So they see them as this great economic benefit. They're not looking at them socially or culturally, it's economics. And I think there's an element of economic resilience to that, but I think there are a lot of other areas in there that we really do need to look at as well. Thanks to Tom Benyon, is he here? Is Tom here? He sent me a reference for a book called Beyond Flying, Rethinking Air Travel in a Global Connected World. As the review of the book says, a single flight cancels out lifestyle efforts such as plant-based diets, energy-efficient homes and recycling. It brings together contributions from 14 different people who have drastically reduced their flying. I've yet to look at the book, but it's certainly going to be informing some of the research that I'm going to be doing. And I think it links very clearly to ideas of future mobilities. As we worry about issues such as climate change, environmental degradation, peak oil and the cost of travel, both in monetary terms but also ethically and morally, and as scenario planning becomes more popular, we need to consider how we might travel in the future. What types of mobility might we practice? What mobilities might become more desired? Virtual, slow travels, will we all start trying to travel more on container ships? And I think this all, of course, links to resilience and resilience planning. So let's think about some context in terms of New Zealand. Climate change is one of the concerns mobilities research is increasingly engaging with, as I've already suggested. From the perspective of access to New Zealand, air travel emissions are a key environmental challenge, and how to best address the climate impacts of any and all discretionary travel remains an elusive problem. It's very much about the importance that people ascribe to travel and how entrenched this is in our daily lives. And this is the context for the work that we're doing on academic mobilities. As I said, my colleagues' interest is very much on the perspective of climate change. I'm very much interested in the mobilities aspect, so not only where, but when we travel and how we commute, how our daily mobility practices intersect with travel at the local, regional and international level. So one of the things that we've been looking at is the research done in tourism on people who go on holiday and those who practice environmentally conscious behaviour. And it's almost like during the year they save up so that they can go away on holiday. They'll be they'll practice environmental sustainable practices at home, recycling, trying to travel to work in different ways, energy saving measures, and then when they go on holiday they don't practice those same things. And so there's lots of discussion in the literature about why they do that and what that means in the longer term for tourism and travel, and how we continue to try and get people to remain environmentally responsible when they travel. Let's put this in a New Zealand context. This was a picture I took at Melbourne Airport on Wednesday night. I was actually taking it to send to my partner to say, guess which plane we're on. We went on the 380, we were on the little New Zealand one in the back. But it's very telling. The picture before that one was taken in 2007, 2008, when that was one of the first Singapore A380s to go out of Sydney Airport. And so we were busy taking lots of photos because it was so unusual, whereas now they're fairly normalised. Let's put it in a New Zealand business context. The Sustainable Business Council released their Vision 2050 report in 2012. In it they say, New Zealand is facing an increasing challenge associated with access. Already isolated and dependent on aviation for the vast majority of visitor arrivals, there is uncertainty as to how the future of transport will impact access to New Zealand. Sustainable fuel options and climate change will have a significant bearing on the future of tourism in New Zealand. They put together a number of scenarios. They have one that's a mobility goal. Mobility in New Zealand is accessible, zero carbon, and facilitates social and economic progress. But it tends to focus on urban transport, i.e. car ownership. And in New Zealand, we are still very much addicted to our cars and to oil. New Zealand's rate of car ownership per capita is amongst the highest in the world. We have the second highest rate of ownership after the US. It's also very focused on freight transport. So they're not really talking about air transport or our travel behaviours in that way. They also have a tourism goal or scenario. Tourism interacts harmoniously with the environment while providing high economic value to New Zealand. This tends to focus on the environmental reputation of New Zealand, so our 100% pure positioning, which isn't necessarily, if you talk to Tourism New Zealand, about the sustainability. At the moment it's 100% Hobbit, I think. So it's not only about sustainability, although from an international perspective that's what it very much is about. So it tends to focus on that environmental reputation, but it's also focusing on staff, the low productivity of staff and how we need to upskill our staff. It's not thinking about who our staff are, how we make the tourism and hospitality industries more welcoming, more of a career so that people want to work in them, how we make sure that they have better wages, better working conditions. It's not talking about any of those things that help individuals survive and look towards the future. It's talking about, oh gosh, they don't work very hard, do they? How do we make them work harder? And I think that's important when we think about it. Okay, but let's go back to academic mobilities. So the project that we did, or that we are doing, has two main objectives. The first is to investigate the individual, social and institutional drivers of academic mobility in an era of climate change. And the second is to explore pathways to reducing emissions intensity or total emissions associated with academic mobility at University of Otago. What we've done so far is an institutional policy overview of 3 universities in New Zealand, Otago, Victoria and University of Auckland, looking at 14 different policies at Otago and Victoria and 17 at Auckland and doing some comparison. And really thinking about what was in them in terms of sustainability and mobility and travel in particular, and trying to see where there were changes or gaps, where there were synergies, where the universities were similar or different. We're just about to go into a second phase where we're doing interviews with randomly selected members of staff from throughout the University of Otago to try and get a better indication of individual travel perceptions. We're at the very small stage at the moment, and we're hoping that this will grow as we look at it in different ways. But one of the things I also think we need to think about is why in academia we are so mobile. And some of that has to do with insecurity in academic positions. And this isn't necessarily limited to early career researchers, but also for grant holders, principal investigators with limited job security and often sometimes forced mobility. It's also about the drivers of perhaps the potential negative outcomes of not travelling, i.e. Ignoring network and career progression opportunities, this global idea of internationalisation amongst tertiary institutions. All of these things have an impact on why we feel that we have to travel. This is just a quote that sort of backs up what I was saying earlier about academics cause global warming. He's concerned about green values. He bikes or walks to his job. He has a well-insulated dwelling, recycles all his waste, even makes a little compost garden. But he also goes through the local airport more than 20 times a year, mostly in order to participate in conferences on sustainable development or give lectures on transport and the environment. And I think that's we all know colleagues who do that, I'm sure. The pictures there are from the Royal Geographical Society conference. They try and be carbon neutral. They can't control for people coming to visit the conference, but the conference itself is generally carbon neutral. And the IAG that we just went to were trying to do that. They did a paperless conference. Not quite sure it worked, but it was close. So Hoyer and Nass, who did this research, question, how can it be that professionals who are concerned about environmental issues and involved in research on sustainability issues in the field of transportation account in their own practice for a travel behaviour representing one of the environmentally most worrying trends in the mobility pattern of contemporary post-industrial society? And I think this is central to a lot of what we're trying to get at. It is the fact that we preach that we need to change our habits, and then we go to the airport and fly. And in New Zealand, it's very difficult to do otherwise. When I first came to New Zealand, the first time I came, I wanted to go visit a friend in Christchurch. And coming from the UK, I spent about 2 weeks looking for railway links before I realised that there was no railway in New Zealand. But it was just inconceivable for me that you couldn't travel by train from Dunedin to Christchurch. So one of the things that we're looking at is that travel appears to be connected to work activities such as conference travel, but also non-work activities, motivations, norms and practices. So they can be, work trips can be perceived as the opportunity to engage in tourism activities, with often universities allowing employees time to take extended trips for leisure time, although I believe in Australia with tax breaks that this might be changing in that you can't necessarily mix the leisure and the business, as someone was telling me the other day. So it could include joining friends and family, extending vacation time, exploring areas you haven't been to before, so all sorts of things like this. So what have we found out? Well, we found a number of themes. One of them is about hollow words, which means that the general lack of meaningful commitment in the policies to sustainability. There's basically been a disconnect between sustainable rhetoric and key university policies, a disconnect within and between different policies. There's implicit assumptions that people want to travel to move their careers forward, and there's gaps evident for those who don't want to travel or aren't happy to travel. And we all know people who don't want to travel, whether it's ethically, because they have young families, or because they care for elders. There's lots of reasons why people don't want to travel. They are not taken into account in any of the policies that we've looked at so far. So they didn't seem to allow for other options for career trajectories. The second theme was unspoken words. And this was implicit assumptions about the necessity to travel, that key policies did not accommodate sustainability practices relating to changing air travel or to any. So they might put in a budget limit, but generally it was the cheapest possible route. They didn't talk about taking different routes to be more sustainable. They didn't talk about time. It was about being as quick as you can. They suggested that there are nothing on limits to travel, and that there was no mention in any of the policies about travel substitution policies. The third one was facilitating mobilities, and this was that many policies actually encourage private travel. They also encouraged people to travel. So for instance, if you travelled enough, you could have car membership. So we often thought that that might encourage people who perhaps only did 18 trips a year to suddenly make up a couple of trips to make sure that they got their car in. So it's actually encouraging people to travel rather than the opposite. And as I said, it might be incentivized. But there were also barriers here caused by approval processes. Either the hoops we have to jump through to be able to travel were barriers, but they were ways that were negotiated. And what we found is that the interpretation of the policies between different departments and divisions does vary quite greatly. There were inconsistencies overall about what business travel was to start with. What types of travel does a university do? Different levels of staff and types of staff. I mean, we've been talking about academic mobilities, but professional or general or administrative staff, they travel a lot too. And that's not even considered in many of the policies. So we need to really look at all of these different things and begin to think about how it could be addressed. So what does this mean for future mobilities? Well, academics actively incorporate aspects of their everyday lives in and through their networks and the constructions of their individual academic mobility. So options to substitute physical travel, including video conferences, need to be thoroughly considered in light of the social cultural context at the moment. And Robin Peace from ESOC-SCI was talking yesterday about how they're approaching tertiary institutions to try and utilise a new networking system now that the access grid is going to be made redundant. And things like that to me are really important ways forward, where we can begin to explore things like that to better connect with people, so that we don't have to fly to Wellington for a 2-hour meeting and then go back to the meeting. One final point. Research in Australia found that for many academics, home was not necessarily tied to Australia or to any other single nation state. Most had a polycentric view of home, and so they consider themselves global citizens and not national citizens. And for me, within the mobilities paradigm, this has a huge impact on how individuals within society act and react to mobility and climate change. And I think that employers, government, policymakers need to think through how, if we as individuals consider ourselves global citizens, how that impacts upon policies, business practices. So mobile methods, it's something that's been growing in the literature for a long time. I'm not going to talk about it too long, but I do want to mention it. The wonderful thing is that over the last couple of days we've seen a number of mobile presentations about mobile methods. Mary Butler's presentation and her walking with her participants. Christian Schott was talking about his walking conference that he's just attended. Helen Vigor's paper on measuring her own commute. Vivian Ivory's paper, which was research that was leading to policy. Karen Witten's paper, looking at areas in Auckland and how traffic calming measures will impact on people's mobility. All of these were very much using mobile methods. And I think that that's really important, that mobilities research isn't just about a single topic. It's not just one thing that moves, but it's this interaction between all of these different things. But also, it's more about this new way of approaching social research, social theory and social agency and bringing them together. But we need to be careful. Peter Merriman's recent article in the Mobilities Journal highlights that we need to think carefully through mobile methods. In a way, we always go back to Lynn McDowell, an economic and feminist geographer, the paper she did way back, I think in the mid-80s, which she called Not Throwing the Baby Out with the Bathwater. In that we can't just say we need to use new methods because they need to be mobile. We need to be a little bit more pragmatic and think about what it is and why we're using the methods we're using and what it is we're hoping to achieve out of it. There was a discussion after Jessica's presentation earlier about methods, and I think these sort of things come back into play. So Merriman says that the debate about mobile methods is in danger of shifting from a discussion of the diverse array of mobilities which can facilitate mobilities research in different ways to a focus on methods that the researcher must move with their research methods. And I think we need to be careful about saying that we must move with, we must use all these innovative methods. It doesn't mean that we can't and we shouldn't explore them, but we shouldn't do it for method's sake. We need to do it for clear methodological and ontological and epistemological reasons, not just because we want to be innovative and different. We had a book that came out late last year, Lifestyle Mobilities, and Catherine King has a chapter in there, and she talks about moving with young people and uses a couple of case studies. And she actually cautions on using innovative methods, because she said that actually through her research, whilst using helmet cameras for mountain bikers was brilliant, in actual fact, the conversations that she had, the interviews that she did, the participant observation that she did, those what we might think of as traditional qualitative methods were equally important to ensuring that she got the results that she wanted. So it's about thinking about how we use our methods, what methods we use, and what we're trying to get out of it. And I think that's especially important when we consider what we're using our research for. And that leads me nicely on to knowledge mobilization. So the ideas that I'm presenting here are based on ideas that Professor Troy Glover from the University of Waterloo is utilising in his keynote address for the Leisure Studies Association conference that's being held in the US a bit later this year. He's talking about leisure studies in particular, but I think that his ideas are really around social science research more generally, and I think it's very much about how some of our work just talk about, often how when we think about how our work can be talked about, it can be just about it as irrelevant. Often this is premised on utility rather than on its actual value. It's also about how our research is used, who is citing it, and has it got influence for policy or practice. And they're questions that we have to more and more ask ourselves about what our research is doing and why we're doing it. However, as I've already suggested with some of the mobile methods, Some of the presentations we saw yesterday, in particular Karen Witten's presentation and Vivian Ivory's work, really show how mobile methods and mobilities can interact with policy and influence what is going on in local government and beyond. And I think that's really important that we look at projects like that, see what they're doing, and ask ourselves how we can continue to work like that so that our academic research really impacts on local communities, on government policy, and influences what is going to happen in the future. So, this knowledge economy is a major policy platform in the US, Canada, the UK, and across the world as regards to research as a key source of economic and political power and social and individual prosperity. Universities are often key to this work, but our work is not often self-evident, and we often need to explain it to other people. However, that lethargic trickle-down model of the knowledge supply chain is often ineffectual and needs disrupting. As active agents, as mobile beings, we as social scientists improve the flow of knowledge among users by opening ourselves to, and this is a quote, non-linear, dialogic, discursive, and multi-directional approaches to research, with the general acknowledgement that all knowledge is socially constructed, unlike unidirectional producer-consumer implications of concepts such as knowledge and technology transfer. That's from SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada. That's from their policy documents. And I think SSHRC seem to have a really forward-thinking idea. They're talking about mobilization, not knowledge transfer in this B2B, business-to-business way where we go and we talk to business and we transfer knowledge and it all works. The trickle-down effect doesn't work either. But it's more that knowledge mobilization is not that traditional linear concept of knowledge transfer or diffusion. Rather, it's more of a process encompassing the co-production and channeling of knowledge that enables the Academy to gain purchase and voice in the policy making and delivery process, supporting our endeavours to make a difference. So knowledge mobilization treats users as co-producers and interpreters of knowledge. It is an active mode of interaction, and it focuses on dissemination, educational interventions, collaborations, and facilitation. And this quote, again using from Gus Speth, is from The Guardian. Fairly recently they did they asked 10, 12 of the top people that they thought were influential in climate change to talk about what was going to happen. And I really like this in that at the bottom, the normal NGO advocacy has been incapable of forcing political systems, especially in the US, to act on what we know. And I think that's where we as researchers really have to get involved to help governments act on what we know. So, in short, and as Troy Glover says, it transcends knowledge mobilization, transcends our campuses, and grounds us in the social realities that drive our research. By moving research knowledge beyond the academy, then knowledge mobilization can increase its social impact. So I see this, it's something I really want to explore more. It's something that Troy and I have only just been chatting about over the last few weeks, but I think it's a really important way of thinking about how mobilities and our knowledge that we make in universities can really come together. And I think to me, it fits much better with how I research and what I research than trying to find an economic benefit of my research or to just write something and hope that eventually it impacts someone. So where does that leave us? Now that picture is from my deck of my house. And the reason that I put it in there is that the lights that you can see are tugboats just going through. So it's just a different form of mobility. So, and it's a damn good view, so I had to put it in. So let's go back to the broader New Zealand context. Mobility is more than just about how we get around. Specifically in New Zealand, it is important to recognise that our productivity and our income is informed by what is going on in the rest of the world. The mobility of people, information, knowledge, money, and things that impact the political, social, economic, and environmental spheres are more interconnected across the globe than ever before. As a bicultural country, it becomes increasingly important to understand how our mobility relates, on the one hand, to a growing sense of global citizenship, and on the other, to the challenges New Zealand faces with issues such as health and well-being, climate change, peak oil, and rising transport costs. So where to from here? I think we need more interdisciplinarity. We need to support networks like ESOC-SCI and all of its networks, not just the Mobilities network. I think we need a continued growth of the events such as this to ensure that we're talking to each other. So we've held this a symposium in a tourism department, now in public health, in geography, in a development department, all of these things, all of these different places allow us to come together in different ways and talk in ways that perhaps we wouldn't have the opportunity otherwise. And it also allows us to engage with researchers within the Academy but beyond. So yesterday we were hearing about how did people hear about the Mobility Symposium. Elizabeth, is Elizabeth here? Yes. Was saying yesterday that she heard about this in London before she even came back to New Zealand from 3 different people. And I was like, yes, that's great. But we also talked about, I wonder how that got to her. But the idea that the Mobility Symposium in little old New Zealand was being advertised in London, to me is fantastic. We need more of that. How do we continue to do that? So where to end? Going back to Mimi Scheller, Mobilities research ultimately can help to reshape academic practice in and for the Anthropocene, marshalling new kinds of disciplinary hybrids, institutional bridges, political commitments and methodological cross-fertilizations to generate transformative approaches to the social, spatial, cultural matrix in which we move, dwell and build a hopefully survivable future. For us as academics, how do we combine the imperatives of PBRF, ERA, REF with the international collaboration, with the measurable and, more importantly, meaningful research that we want to undertake? What does mobility research look like if we break down those disciplinary silos and allow us to begin to see connections across topics and scales, and to recognize the potential for different types of methodologies and where we might go in the contemporary world? And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. So we've got some time for questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions. But, gentlemen, if you can just wait for the microphone because it's being recorded. So that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. That's was really something that I've been thinking about for some years. I stopped flying in 2011 because of, well, partly for health reasons, and partly for ethical reasons as well. And I don't think I've missed anything. Anytime I need to go anywhere within New Zealand, I always take the bus. And it might take an extra day at each end, but I get there, and I actually see the scenery. I meet people as well, and you get to meet people on the way there and spend a bit more time with people. And I think one of the things, I want to come back to a question I asked last night during our Skype session, and that is how digital technology could replace travel and reduce the need for it. Like, for example, we have lots of technologies that we can use. I have never been out of New Zealand for 36 years. I'm starting a global corporation. What I do is I delegate to people using all kinds of electronic media. So, you've got social media, you've got email, you've got Lumio, you've got Skype, you've got video conferencing, Citrix, Google Hangouts, all this sort of stuff which we can use, all kinds of digital tools. Why are we not using that more to run conferences? Why are conferences always tied to place? And why is it always tied to presence? We can transfer knowledge without necessarily being in a place. And this was what digital technology was supposed to do for us. It's supposed to make us place independent. And the other thing that can do is also bring in people who can't afford to travel, people who are from poor countries, people who maybe aren't served by flights anywhere near where they live. And I think that this would improve the cross-fertilisation of knowledge from rich and poor countries alike. So I think that there's a lot that we can do with digital technology, digital media.
So can we take...
Totally agree with you. Travel is so well entrenched in us, and certainly in Western society. And I think what you've actually done is raise a lot of really good questions. Why aren't we utilising the technologies we've got more? Why is there an imperative to travel to face-to-face meetings when they could be equally well conducted through some of these technologies? I don't think we're going to come to a solution overnight, but I think that we need to speak up a little bit more and say, hey, I don't need to do that travel, and I would actually like to just Skype in. I would actually like to involve myself this way. And whilst I don't necessarily think that individual action in the end will change everything, we have to start somewhere, and I think if enough of us say it, enough of us say we need to, at university levels, at the academic, at policy level, we need to be showing good practice. We need to be leading by example. So I think there is some of that. I don't think we'll ever get rid of travel, and people are always going to want to travel, but I think there are ways we can reduce it.
It's important to look at where we're at in a longer term frame in order to really deal with climate change, to really deal with overpopulation, species extinction, etc. It takes a collective total action, and that's not happening, it's not going to happen. Now that's important to realise that, because there were calls in a couple of your slides for greater action by NGOs. Well, there was far greater action to deal with these problems in 1968 than there is now. And have a look at what's happened in the intervening years, and the answer is nothing. It's got far worse. In terms of tourism, if you're concerned about these problems, I've yet to hear somebody in the tourism business suggest that we've got to wind down tourism in New Zealand. Wind down, I mean cut by a factor of 10, if we're serious about those problems, and look to how to give other employment to all these people, and at the same time realise that you should be cutting down on the use of cars, and that employs a hell of a lot of people too. So I guess I come up with a very, very bleak forecast for where we're at. It's not going to happen, we're just going to get worse and worse. And so that it seems a very good idea for you to do all you can, as long as you know that you're...
Yeah, I agree. There's, in tourism you've got hopeful tourism, in geography you've got geographies of hope, and I think we're all very optimistic. And I wonder sometimes about that optimism, or whether it's a bit like the brace position on a plane. You know, it's a way to not realise that we need to panic and do something more. So
I'm suggesting panic.
yeah.
Geography of hope, that's a lovely term. The lady in green.
Thanks. Thanks, Tara. That was a really good talk. It kind of put mobilities into perspective for me, because I wasn't exactly sure what it meant. So now I have a much better idea. I'm with Living Streets Aotearoa Pedestrian Advocacy Group, so I'm really interested in the transport side of things. I was really interested in your academic travel study, but I'm really concerned that there is, hardly any transport people here from Wellington, because I can see there's a whole lot of work that they've been doing, particularly in workplace travel planning, which would really inform some of the stuff that you're doing. And the talk we heard yesterday about children and transport is a message that transport people really need to get. So I'm just wondering if you've got a comment on how we can do it better together.
I wish I knew. I really do. I think forums like this are a start. I think that as policymakers and as academics and everyone in between, we need to talk to each other more. But we also need to talk about what expectations are there. So the idea that we as academics can just produce a wonderful report for someone aren't necessarily realistic. But neither can we as academics go to policymakers and say, hey, give us all your data. So I think we need to just actually start talking more. And I think again, we need to start somewhere. And if it's small scale and it's talking to people that you know and working up from there, then we've got to start doing it. And I agree that transport and mobility, to me, there's so many things that we could be talking about much more. And I think Karen's work that you're, and the group that you're doing up in Auckland is one really good example of how some of those things can come together.
No.
Thank you for your perspective. As a person from a different perspective, I stepped into this lecture theatre this afternoon and saw your animation on the screen of British transport routes, air transport routes, and I instantly saw movements of pathogens rather than people, which may even preclude climate change as a downside.
Totally agree. And it's, when we talk about mobility, it's one thing to me that we don't talk about, or I don't, because in tourism we talk about people. But within that are all of these other mobilities that we don't think about. And transport and planes, you only have to look over the last decade to see the impact that has had globally. SARS, all of those sort of things. And all the research that's been done about them, actually. And it is infiltrating literature like tourism, but we need to consider it much more. And I think That's where, to me, the mobilities, social science, and some of these other areas and disciplines really need to come together more, because, put it together, and I think we could, certainly from a social science perspective, really get some good stuff out there.
Michael.
Yeah, Tara, it's Michael Baker from the department here. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, and I really want to congratulate you for taking on the hypocrisy that's brought into universities in terms of sustainability in our travel patterns. I know just recently this was made really vivid to me, organising a large conference in Auckland, and after a huge amount of effort we were able to get Carbon New Zealand certification, but you realise there's so many barriers in the way of trying to do this properly in terms of I guess policies and even the physical availability of resources like train travel and so on. It's still the biggest one is still the cultural barriers that you're looking at. So I think particularly Otago, we have to do better because we've got 3 sites and there's a huge amount of unnecessary travel. So really congratulations on taking that on, and I hope you can, I mean, there are a lot of supporters for what you're doing, so I hope you can really continue that effort.
I hope we can too. And what gets me is that many years ago in a former life, I was a secretary for a hardware company selling door handles and things like that. And in the early 90s, I wrote their first environmental policy and their first gender equity policy. Otago got their first sustainability officer a year or 2 ago. That's 20 years later, and they're just beginning to talk about it. And Otago's not unique in New Zealand for that, and I'm flabbergasted. Why haven't we been talking about this for decades beforehand? Why is it only now that we're going, oh gosh, we need to think about this? We have 1 person in Otago. How can 1 person do this job? So, yes.
Okay, we probably need to start wrapping up because I guess the symposium will be carrying on. Can I just take the liberty of one final question? There's a lot of questions about mobilities and the effects of mobilities on people and exploring the dynamics of mobility. What about the effects on place and communities of people increasingly perhaps being made up of people who've moved in or not being from that place? Is that something that's being studied? How that affects community values and cultures and so on?
Yes, definitely, and I'm sure many people in the audience can talk to that as well. And Mobilities also talks about immobility, stuckness, stillness, friction we heard about today. So all of these other things that impact upon how we and other things can or can't move, and the impact that has on communities, environments, the non-human, the interactions, all of these sort of things. So yes, and I think it's something that we need to consider more and more.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that was an amazing talk. For someone who's quite new to this area, it's quite mind-boggling actually, because it encompasses so much and so many different disciplines, obviously, with areas of inquiry and methods of inquiry and so on, but also so relevant to how we live and informing that. And I just thought it seems that mobilities almost uniquely seems extremely relevant to New Zealand in a whole variety of ways, and I thought you brought that out really well. And I think also to public health, and this is a public health seminar, so some of those things that move into pathogens and a whole bunch of things that immediately spring out at you, I think, well, that's really relevant. And as a public health research community or practice community, as many of us are who are here today, I think we need to really be thinking about some of the things that you've talked about and how that should inform our practice, our research and so on. So just remains for me to thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Really inspired a lot of thinking, I'm sure. And good luck with the rest of the symposium.
Thank you.